Sophia Mormont.
Thank you very much. Acting President. I value the opportunity to be able to speak to the budget this year. This is great, and I would like to address a few concepts in particular. I'm going to start with complimenting the government to see that they've been taking great advantage of the resources boom and the GST adjustment to keep the state in a reasonably shape fiscally, with $3.3 billion operating surplus and the government's paying down of net debt, resulting in reduced interest payments and a reduced burden for future generations. It is also positive to see robust economic growth of 4.25% and unemployment levels so strong with an unemployment rate of only 3.4%. That is pretty amazing to achieve. However, our state, which is experiencing these robust economic conditions, is also a state that is under pressure. Inflation and costs of living pressure are weighing down on households. As people flock to the state to take advantage of these employment opportunities offered by the mining boom, compounded by pressures at a global and national level, our services, facilities and infrastructure are becoming more strained. Last year, we heard media reports that the average emergency waiting time was 10 hours and that there was one preventable death every 72 hours because the hospital system did not have enough beds. People trying to rent homes in some suburbs of Perth tell stories of 100 or so people turning up to view properties. Psychologists report that demands for their services have increased by 70% each year since the pandemic, and prior to that, demand for mental health services was already rapidly trending upwards. And compared to Perth, these pressures are often many times worse in regional centres. An inequality that no doubt will increase with the abolition of the electorates in the upper house, which is such a shame. This budget, it's also good to see, does show that the government is taking steps to address these pressures and balancing the need to be fiscally responsible with a requirement to ramp up services to meet the needs of a growing state. $2.7 billion in additional investment in health and mental health in the 23-24 state budget will help to reduce the pressures on an overburdened system, including the 600 new hospital beds on top of the 547 beds already promised, and $201 million in funding for mental health. Other important contributions, which I'd like to mention, include the additional $750 million for housing, with a range of different initiatives, almost $1 billion for education, big spending on infrastructure, and a $4 billion royalty for regions, plus the $11.2 billion on regional infrastructure over the forward estimates. However, digging a little bit deeper, it seems that the government is in some way still failing to keep up with meeting the service delivery needs of a changing and growing state, particularly for the most vulnerable members of our community. In areas such as mental health, well, something went really wrong. Hold on. Sorry. In areas such as mental health, out-of-home care and other forms of care for vulnerable people, the government is failing to shift towards prevention, early intervention and community-based approaches that would ultimately save money through more support for problems before they get to acute stages. For example, of the additional funding for mental health, there is no new money for prevention, intervention and community-based programs, but rather it all goes towards clinical-based acute care. This in spite of the fact that the Sustainable Health Review conducted in 2019 found that care was too heavily directed towards hospitals and less towards community-based prevention programs, as did an Auditor General report of the same year. Moreover, for the most recent strategic plan for the mental health sector, the mental and alcohol and other drug services plan 2015 to 2025, most of the targets have not been met and the plan is now rarely referred to by stakeholders in the sector. A similar situation can be seen in relation to out-of-home care for children. The government has been glacially slow to implement its frameworks for improving systems for safeguarding children at risk and increase funding to the necessary level. This includes the implementation of Building a Better Future, the Department of Community's out-of-home care reform program for 2019 and 2023. The report from this review in 2018 recommended that contracts for out-of-home care service providers were retendered to ensure an upgrading of funding and level of service, but this has not happened until now. Hopefully we will see some of that take place later this year. Similarly, the Rapid Response Net framework, which was prepared in 2021, was intended to improve collaboration between the Department of Communities and other departments, has not moved forward. Meanwhile, there are a lack of foster carers, remuneration for them is too low, superannuation needs are not met for them, and requirements are too restrictive, such as the need to have one full-time carer, and new evidence-based approaches are not being taken on board. Importantly, also insufficient resources are going towards keeping families together, which could help to stop the cycle of family breakdowns, delinquency, incarceration, etc. Also, while the strategy to ensure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities retain involvement, it is not clear that there has been enough support to ensure that Aboriginal controlled community organisations will be able to fully effectively take up the role that the department hopes they will play. These are just a couple of examples of how, in relation to supporting the most vulnerable people in our state, the West Australian Government continues to be stuck in acute care, putting out fires mode, in some cases almost literally, such as recently at Banksia Hill, and failing to develop strategies for prevention implemented through community-based approaches. In one of my early member statements, I spoke about the funneling of funding towards crisis care versus preventative care. If you funnel a lot of those funds towards preventative care, in particular in making sure that children and families and single mothers have appropriate housing, stable housing, sufficient income for providing good nutrition to their children, not under any threat of needing to move house regularly, being able to be self-sufficient in that way, making in particular vulnerable single mums more vulnerable to exploitation. You know, one story I've come across in regards to that is that predatory men are using dating apps to particularly source single mums with children. They then use them to use their housing and will also make those women more vulnerable to domestic violence, and there are also cases where they have groomed the mother and the children and are perpetrating child sex abuse crimes against those children. So that happens because those single mums are simply more vulnerable to exploitation, and they're not protected by the system as such. Now, when you look at child sex abuse overall, it appears that the statistics are increasing and not decreasing around that. I've spoken to many people who've experienced child sex abuse when they were younger, and what I'm seeing in the newspapers is an increase in crimes of pedophilia in particular happening. So one of those things that contributes to those crimes is online interactions, so children going online, having access to social media and being groomed by these men. That is one component of that. Porn seems to be another component contributing to a rewiring of the brain, where the normal sexual behaviours are then rewired to more damaging and abnormal sexual behaviours. So another thing noted with that is that the sentences for pedophilia seem to be quite low. So in cases where child sex abuse material was found on hard drives and that versus direct contact with children, the sentencing seems to be inadequate, and paedophilia never is a victimless crime. And when you look at childhood trauma, that is one of the big factors that contributes to misbehaviour as they grow older. You're looking at addictive behaviour as well. You're looking at delinquency, and then a higher risk of ending up in crisis care as they develop. Banksia Hill is a clear example of crisis care. The courts, our prison system, rehabilitation centres, they are all examples of crisis care. Now, you can't expect a society to not have any of that crisis care available. You absolutely do need that. However, the more you invest in safety of children, making sure the family unit can stay together, that single mums have enough money, that there's adequate schooling, adequate services available at the beginning of the life of those children, you are much likely to improve their chances of not requiring crisis care as they grow older. So there's quite a bit of research coming out from different countries that shows that focus on family life, beginning of life, has good results. And whilst initially you spend more money, over the long term, the money saved, the money that will be saved in crisis care, and you end up with a happier, healthier society overall. And I think that is an admirable goal to go towards. Now, one of the things too that we see in children that are more vulnerable is that often they are born with fetal alcohol syndrome as well. And I don't feel that has been sufficiently acknowledged in Banksia Hill, and that those children are being blamed for their delinquency, that they are not being given the support they needed, that it's not being acknowledged that being a victim of fetal alcohol syndrome means that you can't focus, you can't learn, you can't manage your behaviour, you have trouble managing your emotions, and you may have a reduced IQ as well. Now, those children are a product of the system that they are brought up in. And when you look at a lot of those children and their families, there are systemic and institutional inequalities that they have been exposed to. So then you try to provide them with corrective services without fixing those particular inequalities in the system, and then you release them back into that system and you expect them to cope better the second time around. And that is simply not how it works. Now, another component that I'm quite passionate about is general health and well-being. So when you look at our diets, and the Honourable Dr. Brian Walker mentioned that as well, we now have food that really doesn't provide a lot of nutrition anymore. When you look at the supermarket, if you basically just follow the outside of the supermarket, you come across your fruit and veg, your meat, your dairy, and some of your breads, and everything else in the centre of that supermarket is almost superfluous. The more packaging it has, the more chemicals you'll find in there, the more processing it has been exposed to, and the less nutrients that you actually get from that. Now, a lot of these foods that are heavily processed, they taste really nice. So, our taste buds tend to rule our shopping habits, so we end up buying foods that are not necessarily healthy for us. There's also certain trust by people that the products that they buy are not harmful, and often that is not the case. So we're looking at additives, artificial colours, flavourings, high sugar levels, artificial sweeteners, things like sucralose, which have been shown to change the microbiome and lead to leaky gut. Farming practices that contribute to that as well. So you're looking at glyphosate, which is one of the ingredients in Roundup, that disrupts the microbiome as well. And once you disrupt that microbiome, once the gut bugs are affected, what you see in people is an increase in mental health issues, and that is often not acknowledged, that your gut health basically affects how you think. You also see more autoimmune disorders, more cancer, you see more metabolic disorders as well. And when you're looking at metabolic disorders, I'm talking about obesity, which leads to diabetes, which leads to cardiovascular disease, which can also affect kidney function as well. So there are a whole bunch of diseases simply caused by our diet. And I think that is definitely an area where we could make a big difference in by regulating that food production industry. What is interesting too about a high sugar diet and metabolic diseases is that Parkinson's has been linked to a high sugar intake as well. And I think it's now known as type 5 diabetes. I can't remember what type 3 and type 4 are at the moment, but type 1 and type 2 diabetes are very common. Type 1 is the one where you need insulin. Type 2 is that you can usually manage with diet. But type 5 is Parkinson's. Now, with Parkinson's in particular, it can also be caused by methamphetamine addiction. So methamphetamine increases the dopamine release in the brain. And as those dopamine cells are depleted, it sets those people up with long-term use of methamphetamine for early onset Parkinson's. So what we are seeing in the making in this state is an epidemic of Parkinson's patients. Now, my mum has been diagnosed with Parkinsonia, which is kind of a related disease, and I can tell you it's horrifying to see her go through that, to see her lose her independence, her mobility, and her cognitive functions. And I think preventing that in this society, in WA, would be really, it's really important. I don't like to see that type of suffering. Now, with methamphetamine, one of the things that has been shown to help methamphetamine addicts get over their addiction is cannabis. So that will be a useful strategy. There is a clinical trial starting on that right now, and I will update the members, hopefully this year still, on how that's going along. Interestingly enough, Parkinson's and Parkinsonia can also be treated with cannabis products too. So just scanning a bit further through my notes. So when you're looking at the use of glyphosate and other chemicals in our food production, regenerative agriculture is one of the best ways to create healthy paddocks, create healthy food, and create healthy animals. So I was very lucky to go to the dam in Denmark and try some hemp-fed beef, which was high in omega-3 fatty acids. And I have to say, it was one of the best steaks that I've ever had in my life, and I'm quite the connoisseur. But the thing is that when you look at our food supply, and you're looking at cattle that has been fed grains, there's a higher rate of inflammatory factors in that meat. Animals from feedlots also display higher stress as well. They have more cortisol in their systems too. So the type of meat that we eat can affect our health directly, and the quality of the food that those animals eat directly affects their health as well. So having more omega-3s in our meat means that we have less inflammation, less cardiovascular disease, and better brains. It also means that we have happier, healthier animals overall, and with regenerative agriculture practices, you are sustaining the land, you're improving the health of the land as well. So from an environmental perspective, that's a really good idea. You're also reducing the load of herbicides and pesticides within agriculture as well. And those herbicide and pesticide residues that we get on food can once again negatively affect our microbiome. So the whole system is involved in this, from manufacture to food production to growing our food. Obviously, I would like to see organic food growing wherever possible. We're very lucky in WA with a lot of farmers, in particular vineyards, starting to adopt those principles as well. There was some research showing that feedlot animals produce less methane, and obviously that is an important factor in farming, but there's also research showing now that hemp-fed animals also produce less methane as well. Now, moving on, as time goes on and our state continues to grow, the need to transform our approach to service delivery will only become more pressurised. And the government is currently missing out on revenue that could be used to support the needed transformation of service delivery in important sectors such as health, education and community support. A report recently commissioned by the Legalised Cannabis Party of WA estimated that the legalisation of cannabis would bring in $1.25 billion in additional government revenue over the forward estimates from 2023 to 2028, based on a modest 25% taxation model and 1.5% annual growth. It's crazy that the West Australian government is missing out on this revenue due to an outdated narrative that cannabis is bad for health and morality. This needs to change. I would also like to touch on the issue of economic development. As you are all no doubt aware, the government has a platform to diversify away from mining for obvious reasons, such as the fact that it makes us vulnerable to potentially volatile markets, and let's face it, it can't last forever. It is not a sustainable resource. The framework for economic development future state, Accelerating Diversity WA, identifies 9 targeted sectors, specific diversification opportunities, including the production and scaling of renewable hydrogen, advancing critical mineral processes, the manufacture of medical products and digital healthcare devices, decommissioning of oil and gas infrastructure, naval shipbuilding, sustainment and maintenance, development of regional tourism destinations, manufacture, utilisation and maintenance of space and cross-sector technologies, development of new carbon capture, utilisation and storage projects, and value-added food and beverage production. So we are starting to see more of the value added to food and beverage production. There is a couple of WA companies now making hemp-infused gins and vodka and beer. And whilst alcohol is not necessarily the best form to take things in, it is good to see that at least some more useful components are being added to drinks there. We will also see an increase in functional foods that way too, with the development of different terpenes. In reading about the sectors selected above, I can't help but wonder, what were the KPIs in selecting them? I mean, clearly we're looking for big earners that match the lifestyle to which we have become accustomed, with our top-notch economic growth of 4%, well above the 2.5% Australian average. But are they sectors that will provide employment for people from all walks of life? Will they breathe life back into regional towns? It is noticeable that the mining sector, with its FIFO workforce, is not doing a great job of building towns and communities. We may be one of the richest states, but we may also be one where the social fabric is the most broken, with so many people spending half their life in dongas and so many families spending so much time with an absent parent. Also, with the strategy to attract people to WA as a tourism and investment hub, and also chosen international education destination, which is mentioned in the budget papers, I wonder how we will put them all up, given that we are having a lot of trouble housing the people who are here already. What is also noticeably missing from the budget papers and the economic diversification strategy is a focus on specific agricultural commodities. There is no specific mention of developing particular industries such as hemp, cannabis, wine, wool, or avocados. At the Legalised Cannabis Party, we think a focus on agricultural commodity development is important. It can help sustain regional centres and towns as other industries such as coal and native forestry become unviable. Industrial hemp in particular would provide outstanding potential benefits for the state. We believe that by failing to develop this commodity chain, WA is missing out on a huge market opportunity. There's big local demand for hemp products made from seed, flower, fibre and hurd, but currently are being made from imports. We have so much space in WA, and hemp is such an adaptable plant. It doesn't need pesticides or fertilisers or herbicides quite so much. It uses less water than cotton, is more climate proof in that sense. It's hardy, it grows really rapidly, and that would be a great way to replace the native logging industry, for instance. It would also create industry around making paper, cloth, and other artisan sort of products. So there's opportunities there to replace imported hemp hurd and fibre seed and flour with locally grown and processed material. In 2019 cropping season, 59,000 hectares of hemp were grown in the US and 17,900 hectares were grown in France, but only 280 hectares in Western Australia. By 2027, the global hemp market is projected to reach 18.7 billion. As a building material, hemp also sequesters carbon at all stages of production, from plant through to hempcrete blocks, where it continues to draw in carbon throughout its lifetime. Due to various roadblocks, sometimes commodity chains require a bit of a lift up before they can really get wings. The state government could usefully support hemp industry development through grants for supply chain actors, particularly processing facilities and subsidies to reduce prices until industries have been established. Currently, hardware chains are held at ransom by companies who supply building materials, like bricks and wood. They are threatened with reduced discounts if they choose to stock hemp building products. I don't believe that companies should dictate environmentally friendly building processes. This should be something that the government should support, and as consumers we should absolutely have the choice to choose for more environmentally friendly building products, more sustainable building products. So that's it from me. There are so many sectors and aspects of the budget that deserve consideration and discussion, and I've only been able to mention a few here, focusing mostly on the aspects that ally with the ethos of the Legalised Cannabis Party.